Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Maria Foscarinis. She started out her career as a big firm lawyer in New York, but she gave it all up about 20 years or so ago to devote her attention and her efforts to homelessness. She founded an organization called the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and she's using the courts and her role as an advocate to change the way people think about homelessness and to change the rights of the homeless, particularly in the area of decriminalizing homelessness. She's also partnered with former pop star Cyndi Lauper's organization, True Colors, in producing a state-by-state analysis of laws and regulations that affect the homeless. And this is a particular issue that is very prominent throughout the country, the problem of LGBT youth and homelessness. It's a fascinating episode, her personal story, and the issue of homelessness and how the power of the law, the good of the law, can be used to have a dramatic impact on this national problem. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we are talking about homelessness and poverty and the connection between the two, and what one person and what one organization dedicated to eradicating homelessness in our country is doing about it, and how the law is such an important part of her efforts and her organization's efforts. And so I welcome Maria Foscarinis. Maria, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Well, thanks for having me, Aaron. It's delightful to be here with you.
Maria is the founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. As I understand it, the only national organization that is committed to and fully dedicated to this issue of homelessness and poverty. And so many different projects and initiatives that Maria and her organization are engaged in to deal with this problem. I thought, Maria, we could start, if you wouldn't mind. I've read a lot of the material on your website. It's a great website, by the way, and we will recommend it, put a link to the website so people can check it out for themselves. But I spent a good bit of time this morning reading a lot of the material on your website, including your own personal story. And I think it's important for people to know that, because it seems pretty clear that that's been a very powerful motivation for you personally in how you got involved in this issue in the first place. So perhaps you could start there.
Sure. Well, there are kind of two aspects to my own personal story. So the immediate way that I got involved with the issue of homelessness in particular was by taking a pro bono case representing homeless families. And this is while I was working as a litigator at a big law firm in New York, Sullivan and Cromwell, a corporate law firm. And
Right.
I had the opportunity to do pro bono work. And, like many firms, this firm offered that opportunity. And I ended up representing homeless families in a class action case who had been denied emergency shelter in a suburb of New York City, Long Island suburb of New York City. And through that case, I went out to visit the families and just really saw the extreme poverty that was within this otherwise wealthy suburb. And it made an impression. And I also got to see how I, as a lawyer, could really make a difference for these families and for this issue more broadly, how I could have an impact. And that was a really powerful experience for me. I, of course, knew that poverty is a big issue in the United States, and I knew that law could make a difference, but this was actually experiencing it firsthand.
Well, and just for people who have never worked in a big law firm and may not appreciate the context for what you're describing here, lots of lawyers go to work for big commercial law firm, and they're representing real estate development companies and companies involved in mergers and litigation and between big companies, and they might take on a pro bono case, meaning a case they work on for no charge, for free, for some public interest, uh, on some public interest topic, or for a client who can't afford a lawyer in many instances, and that's often a sort of a side gig to the real work that they're doing and getting paid for. But it sounds like that one experience is what drew you to want to not do this just on the side, but actually engage in this work full time. How did that come
Absolutely.
about for you?
Well, so I should also add that, you know, I went to the firm. So at the firm, I was representing, as you mentioned, big corporate clients. I was representing Goldman Sachs. I was representing Exxon. I mean, this is a huge contrast to those clients and the resources they had. That's a huge contrast to these homeless families and the resources available to them. And it's a powerful contrast. And, the pro bono experience is being able to bring resources of a big firm to people who would otherwise very likely go unrepresented. And yeah, so that's what drew me. And it wasn't, looking back, it wasn't truly just that one experience. It was also the legacy, the sort of my family's legacy, which
Mm-hmm.
is rooted in Greece during the time of the German occupation during the Nazi period. And Greece was occupied by the Germans, by the Nazis, and people suffered a great deal. And, people were literally dying of starvation, even though food was available
Mm-hmm.
in the countryside. And it's that sort of disparity, that contrast, that needless suffering. In the case of these homeless families, they're in a country, they're in a community that has the resources, and yet they are without really the basics that human beings need to survive. So that, I think that experience also tapped into this sort of larger sense of unfairness in our world and in our country. And, I think that's something many people can relate to. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think I happened to have this opportunity to actually get more deeply engaged. And, that came through this particular case. And, and the opportunity the firm gave me to take it on. And I was working with um, a local advocacy organization, the Coalition for the Homeless in New York.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones who had initiated this case and had approached the firm looking for volunteers. They had so this was now I'm going to date myself, but that's okay. Um, so this was in the early to mid 1980s. And that was coincided with a time that homelessness was really becoming a big crisis in the United States.
Right.
And it was, in many ways, these families were kind of emblematic of that, because all of a sudden lots of people were becoming homeless, and especially families. And this was happening everywhere, not just in urban centers, but across the country in suburbs and also in rural areas. So this was very quickly becoming a national crisis. And the group I was working with, the nonprofit group, was interested in starting an office in Washington to develop a national campaign to get the federal government to take action. And that seemed like an exciting opportunity to me. And so I signed up for that. And I left the firm, moved to DC to start this effort. And
Well, and
that,
I'll just throw in another factor here. to the story, and it's one that I intersect with just a little bit. And you've been very modest to leave out this part of your background, but I know you went, as you mentioned, you grew up, without a lot. Your family did not have a lot of means, yet you were able to go to a Barnard College in New York for college, and I happened only a few years behind you to go to Columbia College, right across Broadway, right across the street in Morningside Heights, and then you went to Columbia Law School, and I know and remember well in the 80s being in New York City at a very privileged Ivy League law school, in my case, a college, as I went to Columbia College. And there was a lot of talk at the time about the issue of homelessness. And when you're there, part of an elite and privileged, university environment, but around you, is the rest of people who live in the city, and you see the homelessness and you see the low income conditions all around you. That's also a very powerful part
Right.
of a person's education. I imagine it must have been for you as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's all about these contrasts and why, some people have so much and other people don't have really what they need to live. And the unfairness of that is very
Right.
powerful, I think. And just to correct something, I consider that I actually did grow up with a lot of privilege. I was
Mm.
able to um, the suffering of my family was during the war, and it was a
Hmm.
result of the war.
Yeah.
But I did not experience that myself. I grew up with a relative amount of privilege and got to go to these elite schools, as you mentioned, and so I feel that I have had a lot, and that's also, how can I use that privilege to do something positive,
Hmm.
and how can I use these tools, and how can I use the power of the law? That's actually our mission, to use the power of the law. It is a powerful tool, and and turn it into something good. So
Well,
that's
tell us about that then, because and I'm a big believer in the power of the law as well. Um, how did you go from the Coalition for the Homeless to starting the National Law Center on Homelessness? How did you make that? Would
so
seem like a big step to start a brand new organization from nothing.
Yes, it was a big step. The bigger step, though, for me, I think, was leaving the firm, leaving Sullivan and Cromwell to start the DC office for the Washington office for the coalition, because that's something I did alone. There was nothing here. And
Hmm.
so it
Right.
was basically me coming here, renting space, buying a phone in those days, doing all those things. And,
A real
it was
phone,
like
not a cell
a
phone.
real phone. Yeah. I mean, just all of that stuff that is involved in starting anything. And, just with a legal pad, with a half page list of potential contacts in Washington. So that was, in going from all the resources that you have available to you at a big firm to not even having a secretary was quite a
Hmm.
transition. So
Right.
that was the big leap from my perspective. And then also coming to DC, trying to work on it. Homelessness at this time was becoming a crisis, but it was certainly not seen as a political issue. And it wasn't seen as an issue for action by Congress. It wasn't seen as an issue for action by the executive branch. So that was a huge challenge. And I spent before I started the law center, I spent 3 years um, building the office of in Washington and developing and running this campaign, or actually carrying out the campaign, because in the beginning it was just me, and trying to get the federal government to respond to this crisis. this was the era of Ronald Reagan, and at the time, Reagan was taking the position that homelessness is a lifestyle choice.
Right.
It's just, people like to live outdoors, and that's just how it is. And it's not something that the federal government should do anything about.
Well, but they
Surprising to me.
well, wait, before you go, but they were doing things, and I was in Washington around the same time period you're talking about. And I remember there were some things that the Reagan administration did that impacted homelessness, right? There were steps taken that released a lot of individuals who may have had psychiatric issues onto the streets. There were cuts to funding to cities
Right.
that
Oh,
contributed to all kinds of issues cities were trying to deal with in
right.
that time. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
and then there was the whole thing about calling ketchup a vegetable, as I remember that
Right,
very well
right.
too.
Yes, yes, yes. Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. Right, and this goes to the kind of good law, bad law um, theme, because there were lots of things that the Reagan administration did that led to the sudden increase in homelessness. And the primary, there are all kinds of cuts to social safety net programs, but the huge cut to federal housing programs, low-income housing programs, had an impact that is still being felt. And those funds for federal support for low-income housing, those funds were cut very dramatically. So just to give you a sense of the scale, in 1979, the federal government was funding over 300,000 new units of affordable housing for poor people annually. And then in 1982, that number went down to under 3,000.
Wow.
So this is a huge cut, and it had a big impact. And the leading cause of homelessness is the lack of affordable housing, and the withdrawal of funds for this help that had been provided had a lot to do with it. But also cuts in other types of social benefits. What you're talking about with the mental institutions or deinstitutionalization, that is actually something that started under President Kennedy, and it started with a good goal, which was that people, who had been institutionalized could function in the community if they were given adequate support. And you know, the second part of this didn't happen. The first part happened where people were, a lot of state institutions closed. People were let out, mainly in the 70s, but continuing through the into the 80s, and then they were abandoned. What Reagan did was cut certain benefits, certain known as SSI benefits, Social Security, disability benefits for people who would otherwise have been eligible for them.
I see.
So just adding to that impact.
Okay, so and then what led you after a couple of years in Washington working on this to set up a new organization, and what was the idea that this organization would be focused on that was different from
Sure.
what you'd been doing?
Well, so the idea was to focus very specifically on legal advocacy. So the coalition did all kinds of things, including providing services, not my office in DC, but the organization, which was still based in New York at the time, and community organizing. And I wanted to, and the Law Center focuses specifically on legal strategies and legal advocacy. By the time I left the coalition to start that in 1989, we had a big success with the passage of the Stewart-McKinney Act, now known as the McKinney-Vento Act. That was the first federal legislation to address homelessness, the first major legislation, still the major legislation to address homelessness. And 2 years after that is when I started the law center. And one of our key goals was to ensure that this new law would be actually enforced and implemented, and then to also build on it. So that was the idea of the law center, and that's what we've been doing.
Well, and can you give us an overview, if you would? And I know we've already, you and I discussed the fact that we're going to have trouble getting all of this into an hour here. So I know this is a very open-ended and very broad question, but as the Law Center has evolved, can you give us an overview of what the major focuses have been and what the major focuses are today? And we're going to talk, just so folks know where we're going, we are going to talk specifically about one very important case that the Law Center won very recently involving homeless in Boise, Idaho. And we'll talk about that. And I also want to save some time toward the end to talk about some of the advocacy work you've been doing and the publication of this really impressive report called the State Index on Youth Homelessness. But before we get to some of those specific examples of your work, give us, if you would, an overview of the areas that you've concentrated in on the litigation side, on the impact litigation side, and on the advocacy side.
Sure. So we have concentrated, our goal is to end and prevent homelessness. And so we have focused on that sort of long range goal in our work. In terms of litigation, we have, well, let me back. So a lot of the response to homelessness, certainly the early response, has been very focused on emergency relief. And the initial federal legislative response that I worked on, that I mentioned, was comprehensive, but most of the funding was concentrated in emergency shelters, which are important, but not a long-term solution. They're not the same as actually providing affordable permanent housing. So a lot of our effort has been to try to move beyond that emergency relief towards longer term solutions. And a lot of our early advocacy was enforcing the provisions of this law, but also shaping law to move beyond it. So getting enacted new policies. So just to give an example of that, we've been very active in creating protections for domestic violence survivors, housing protections and housing rights for domestic violence survivors. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women, primarily women, not only women, but
women and children, women. I would imagine.
And exactly, and their children who are, faced with the dilemma of either staying with an abuser or fleeing and then not having any place to live. So protecting the housing rights and providing housing options for these survivors is a critical way to prevent them from becoming homeless. So years ago, over 10 years ago, we got involved in adding housing rights language to the Violence Against Women Act, and that was successful. And that's something we've built on and have had a number of legislative successes in expanding those protections.
Well, and I think that's a great example, and we noted this in the beginning that the actual name of your organization is the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Because I think when people think about homelessness, if they're thinking about it, probably most people are just walking past people they might see on the street and not really thinking about it. But when they think about addressing the problem of homelessness, I think a lot of people think about shelters as an answer. And you're pointing out that at best, and not that this isn't important to have, but that at best, a shelter is only a temporary fix to a problem. But to get at the real fixes is to find the causes of homelessness and address those,
Right.
and look at housing issues. So I didn't mean to interrupt your overview, but I think that seems very important to appreciate, and I'm appreciating it as you explain this, that you really can't look to address homelessness in any fundamental and long-term way unless you address these deeper issues we have leading to homelessness.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And you're right that a lot of people don't understand that. And we deliberately put the word poverty in our name because there had been this idea out there, and it's still out there, that homelessness is somehow something different than poverty, and homeless people are different than other poor people. And really, this is a continuum. I mean, people, of course, people who are very poor are more vulnerable to homelessness, but really, there's a spectrum of housing need, and a lot of people have trouble affording a place to live, and some people end up becoming homeless, and we need to address the causes. Shelters are not a solution, and right now there's not even enough shelter. But even if there were, this is not a solution. It's temporary at best. It's a band-aid at best. In terms of other issues we work on, kids, homeless children, that's a critical issue. The right to go to school, that's also something that people often don't think about. But if you're a homeless child, you may not have the ability to stay in school, which is critical, both for kids at the moment and also to prevent them from becoming homeless in the future.
Well, and just on that, Maria, I there was an article that just came out very recently, based on a report by the Advocates for Children of New York that reveals that 1 in 10 school children in New York City are homeless. 1 out of every 10. And
Right.
and this was, I thought, an incredible quote in the story, that the number of students, these are children, the number of students who are homeless in New York City would fill Yankee Stadium twice.
Wow.
So if anybody's wondering how big a problem is this, even as we continue, every day to walk by any number of kind of nameless faces that we see in the street, on the sidewalks, and Yankee Stadium filled twice gives you a pretty powerful image to think about when thinking about the size of this problem.
Right. It's a huge problem. And, that may even be an underestimate. It's a huge problem for these kids, and also, well, for their families, of course, but for all of us and for their futures. Because if kids, um, these kids are growing up under very tough conditions, and, making sure that they can at least get some kind of stable education or some continuity in their school experience is something that can help them, and both address their immediate needs and also help give them some kind of chance for the future.
Right.
And in this federal law that I spoke about, the McKinney-Vento Act, there is actually guaranteed a right to school continuity, the right to go to school despite the fact that they don't have an address, and a right to stay in their school, the school that they were in before they became homeless. But just as just because there's a right doesn't mean that that right will be enforced. And so this is an issue we've been working on since our inception, enforcing this right, making sure that it becomes a reality. And we do that in a number of ways. One way is through impact litigation. We've litigated a number of cases to make sure that kids who are homeless actually are able to go to school. And we've also worked to get the law strengthened, and gotten federal guidance and all of the tools that lawyers use to try to strengthen rights. And there's another piece of our work, which is that we also do a lot of educational outreach. So creating Know Your Rights materials. People can't claim a right if they don't know they have it. And so a lot of our work is doing that kind of outreach and education.
Okay, so I think another uh, an aspect of our conversation that's important, so people understand some of the specific things that can be done to address the problem is, and we've touched on this a bit so far, is the scope of the problem. I mentioned this study that's just out just on New York City, but I wonder if you could give us a sense of the scope of the problem nationwide, and um, is it getting worse? Are there more homeless today than say there were 10, 20, 30 years ago? And other than, or in addition to domestic violence, which you already mentioned as a leading cause for homelessness among women, and yeah, what are some of the other leading causes today? Is the shortage of low income housing still the issue it was when you started? Is the opioid crisis something that contributes to the homelessness problem today? If you could just speak to
So
that a bit.
sure. Well, the shortage of affordable housing was and remains the leading cause of homelessness. There's no doubt about that. There's an extreme shortage of affordable housing in this country, and it really affects everyone, but it affects poor people most extremely, such that some of some people who are very poor become homeless, and that is the leading cause right now of all people who are poor enough to be eligible for federal low-income housing assistance. Only 1 in 4 actually receives it because there's because of the funding cuts I talked about.
Hmm.
Um, so that's a huge disparity, and there's studies that show that there's a shortage of over 7 million units affordable to extremely poor people. So that really underlies the crisis of homelessness. Other factors contribute to it. So, of course, sure, the opioid crisis right now is having an effect and is certainly influencing the homelessness of a segment of people. Um, and that's true. People who are homeless have other problems. Um, there's a disproportionate percentage suffers from mental illness. It's not the majority; it's a significant minority, though.
Hmm.
Um, Jobs. I mean, that lack of adequate income is sort of the flip side of the housing crisis. So there's a surprising percentage of people who are homeless who actually work, either full time or part time,
Mm.
but don't make enough money to pay for housing to be able to afford housing. So all of these factors are relevant and are driving this, but the kind of common thread is the lack of affordable housing, even with something like the opioid crisis, which could affect, in theory, could affect anyone. Having a place to live um, can make a key difference in your chances for recovery and for treatment.
Well, and it seems like there are such profound challenges to address the needs of uh, those people who do find themselves homeless for whatever, uh, whichever one of these many possible causes. Drug use, mental illness, losing a job, uh, lack of access to affordable housing, or maybe even all of the above. But then there are what seem like that much more insurmountable challenges when you talk about the root causes of these problems in the first place. So, is where do you see? Um, I want to get into the subject of this important case uh, from Boise because it speaks to the problem on a day-to-day, night-to-night basis for so many of these people. But where do you see the most promise in either dealing with the day-to-day problems homeless face or in getting at some of these root causes? Where do you see the greatest promise at this point?
So, right now, and actually for years, there has been a focus in many cities on people who are unsheltered and living in public spaces. And a lot of that focus has been very negative, using the law in some very putative and ultimately counterproductive ways. So in many cities around the country, there are laws that make it a crime to live outside and to essentially criminalize homelessness.
Yeah.
So, for example, cities are enacting laws that make it a crime to sleep in public places or to camp or to loiter or to eat in public or sit down or lie down. So, or to ask others for help, to panhandle. So these are, there are lots of different permutations of these laws. Taken together, they amount to criminalizing homelessness. And this is kind of the front line in a lot of communities of advocacy because and of city response because cities understandably don't like having people who are visibly poor living in public places. But instead of actually solving the problem, what they're doing is passing laws that make it a crime. Advocates are fighting this, and we're often litigating on or otherwise challenging these kinds of laws because they don't make sense. But I think they also present an opportunity because I think we can all agree that people shouldn't be living outside. The question is, what do you do about it?
Right.
Do you pass these laws that make it a crime, or do you perhaps enact some better laws that create some housing rights or that actually create some housing for people? And so we have recently started a campaign called Housing Not Handcuffs, where we make the case for housing as opposed to criminalization. And there's an opportunity, especially now, because we have some there are some cost studies that show that it is actually less expensive to house people than to try to bring the criminal justice system to bear in an effort to push them out.
Well, and that's Maria. That's the perfect segue, actually, to this case from Boise, Idaho, a case called Martin versus City of Boise that the Law Center was involved in and achieved, I think, in a very important victory.
Yeah.
I read the opinion from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals,
Yeah.
the Federal Court of Appeals on the west part of our country, and was fascinated that the appeals court, decided this case as a matter of the Eighth Amendment
Yeah.
against cruel and unusual punishment. And we just recorded actually an episode that'll be the episode that precedes this one on the Eighth Amendment when it comes to capital punishment and lethal injection. And it just was striking to me because, of course, capital punishment, at least we like to think, and I think mostly it is, reserved for the most heinous crimes, the most violent crimes, murder
Right.
and rape and kidnapping, and the worst crimes uh, are at issue in a conversation about the Eighth Amendment there. And here, in this case involving homeless, the most innocuous seeming crimes, loitering or
Right.
sleeping out for the night under in a public space, the court again sees this as an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment issue. So
Exactly.
that's my little introduction and spin, but
Yes.
it was
Yes. Yeah.
fascinating to me.
Right.
So tell us about this case, what happened, and how the court resolved the issue.
Right.
There.
So the city of Boise has a so-called anti-camping ban where you're not allowed to camp in public places and essentially defines camping as sleeping. And so you're not allowed to sleep anywhere in public. And the I mean, the Eighth Amendment comes into play because the Eighth Amendment says it's cruel and it's a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, but it also applies to what can be made criminal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's making something which is not only innocuous but actually necessary for every human being, namely sleep, making that criminal constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And it's one way to think of it as a status conduct distinction. Basically, you're criminalizing someone for who they are, for their status,
Yeah.
because if you're homeless, by definition, you have nowhere else to sleep but in public.
Right.
And when that becomes a crime, that's the key.
Yeah.
And the city of Boise argued, well, in fact, people have a place to sleep because they're shelters. And so then we had to show that, in fact, these shelters were not actually available. There are 3 shelters in the city, 2 of which are gospel missions where there's religious expectations and requirements, and but they also are, you can only stay in them for 15 nights out of every month. I mean, each of the shelters has not only limited capacity but also rules preventing people from staying there for a longer period of time. So we were able to show that shelter was not actually available, and people were required to sleep outside. And the court said that this is cruel and unusual punishment, and it's unconstitutional. And it's very important. This is not the first time a court has made a ruling like this, but this is a very strong ruling, and it was especially important that the court didn't go along with this argument from the city about the availability of shelter and looked behind their claims to find that, in fact, it was not available. And of course, the Ninth Circuit covers such a huge part of the country that, we're already seeing the impact of it, and hopefully we'll be able to see some more impact.
Well, and what I think the point that you made about this, and it strikes me that this is really what the court is saying here. That is very profound, and they don't exactly come right out and say this, but then they do, and it reminded me. And here I'm going to go and give some obscure music reference, and I can already hear my wife saying nobody remembers those songs, but it reminds me of a song by the artist Bruce Hornsby, and I don't remember the title of the song, but it tells a story of a guy walking by a homeless person, and then in the song he says, "Get a job," to the guy, and it strikes me that this is really a repudiation of that, because and I think there is a bias that so many of us have, that somebody is homeless and on the street by choice. And that if they'd only just get up on their feet and go get a job and go somewhere else, they wouldn't be where they are. And the court here is saying, if there were adequate shelter beds, they wouldn't be on the street. If there was some way in which they could not be on the street, they wouldn't be on the street. And that seems just so defining in how the court addressed this issue overall.
Right. Well, and it's part of the constitutional argument, right? I mean, if people were out there because they wanted to be, or they just enjoyed being out there, that would has constitutional consequences.
Right. Well, but if they had a choice, then it wouldn't be a constitutional issue. It is cruel and unusual to punish people who are not there by choice.
Exactly.
That is who they are. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So you see, you think that this case, I mean, of course, the Ninth Circuit is a very influential court of appeals. It's not the Supreme Court, obviously, but you see this as having an impact as other communities pay attention and maybe
Yeah.
pay attention to the cost piece too. And maybe there's a bias that,
Right.
well, we can't spend money on shelters, but people don't often think about the cost associated with putting someone through the criminal justice system. That's a very expensive
Exactly.
process.
Right. 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 So I think what this does is clearly it has a direct impact on in the Ninth Circuit, which covers a very large part of the country. I mean, that's 9 or 10 states right there that are covered, and it's of course not binding on the rest of the country, but it's still persuasive authority. But I think beyond the strictly legal impact, there's also the policy and political impact, where I think cities are beginning to realize that this is not, or some cities at least, and it's partly because of the cost, that there is a cost to sending police out and prosecuting cases and putting people in jail, and that's expensive. And now we have um, the data to back that up, and that gets the attention of cities. And and not only does it is it expensive, it doesn't solve the problem. I mean, people will still be there even if they are jailed or moved on to some other part of town. They'll still be somewhere,
Well,
and they'll come out of jail.
might give someone a place to sleep for a night or two, but then they're out of jail and they're in the same position they were in before,
Exactly,
and
and
subject to
not
the same punishment.
right. And it's they're actually in a worse position because now they have a record,
Yeah, that's
and it
true.
will be even harder to get a job or get into housing or really get much of anything. So it really makes the problem worse. And having a court sort of draw a constitutional line can help spur a political response. And we would like to. I mean, our plan is to make that case, because I
Mhm.
don't know that it's going to happen necessarily by itself. But with this, we can push cities in a more constructive direction.
Right. Okay. Well, now I promised that we would save a little time at the end to talk about this report that's just come out that the Law Center's put out. Actually, partnering with another organization, True Colors Fund, which
Yes.
is the the organization that was started by Cyndi Lauper. So
Right.
tell us a little bit about what this is and how you came to partner with her and with that organization, and then we can talk a bit about the special problem of LGBT youth and how that plays into the problem overall of young people and homelessness.
Sure. So youth homelessness is a big issue, and as you note, there's also strong crossover with LGBTQ issues, because about 40% of homeless youth are identify as LGBTQ.
Mm,
So a big overlap
wow,
there,
that's
and
incredible.
the issue of homeless youth, this is something we've worked on for quite a number of years, but this is the first time we partnered with True Colors Fund. It's a good partnership. We each bring different perspectives to the work, and they have more of an LGBTQ focus, and we have the law focus, and we brought the two together to create this state index, which it looks at homeless youth generally, but we look at among the things we look at are legal rights of these youth. The laws governing or the laws that apply to homeless youth or don't apply, or some laws are good. They're
Hmm.
positive. They help, to the extent that there are laws that protect youth or allow them to be emancipated and exercise some legal rights, some legal control over their lives, and get access to resources. That's a helpful thing. But there are also laws that penalize them or don't allow them to get access to, don't allow them, for example, to enter into contracts or um, get health care that they might need, or that truancy laws that can unfairly penalize them. So we looked at a lot of different different laws. We also assessed the environment, and we did this state by state. So most of these laws are a matter of state law. So we looked at all of the states, the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and assessed legal rights and also environment, systems, how are youth treated, how are LGBTQ youth treated, or is the environment hostile, is it not, is it more welcoming? And we basically graded each state so that, we had, I think, 62 indicators, and we took all of them into account and assigned a grade to each state, and with detailed reasons for the grade. And the idea is that this is now useful as a tool for state level advocates who, and also for state policymakers interested in this issue, for how they need to improve, recommendations for how they can do better to meet the needs of these youth, and a way to hold them accountable. We're planning to issue this annually.
Right, because you're looking at all these different variables. What are the support services offered? What are the laws that might be punitive? What type of training is there for staff who are involved? All these different variables. And then it really is a report card, state by state by state. So if you're in, Kentucky or you're in Connecticut, you want to see how your state's doing, you can look and actually see where your state gets high marks and where it gets low marks. So it's an area for, she points out the areas that can be worked on for improvement. And notable is the fact that really none of the states get much of a passing grade. I mean, it looks like the states that ranks number one, after this analysis, barely passes with, I think, a score of 65. Washington State has a score of 65 and was number one in the rankings, but there's still a lot of improvement, even in a state that ranks, number one out of all the states.
Exactly. Yes, and that's exactly right. So lots of room for improvement, but this is the idea was to provide a baseline and a tool for advocates, and something that actually has some practical ideas for how to remedy some of these failures.
And this report, I know I found it. It's on the website for the Law Center. Do you want to? We'll include it in the description, but just for people listening, do you want to just give a mention for how people can get to the Law Center, how they can get to the website and get a lot more information on this?
Yes, we'd love to have visitors to our website.
I thought that might be a yes.
Yes. Thank you for prompting that, Aaron.
Sure.
So it's www.nlchp.org. So NLCHP, those are our organizational initials, and we have lots of materials there, reports, other resources, manuals, information, and you can find it all there.
And if you want particularly to learn more about this last issue that we've been talking about and look at the 2018 state index, you can certainly read the summary information in the front, but then you can go look for the detail on your state and see how your state is doing and how it's not doing, and it's fascinating. And the plan is to follow up with this every year and update it. Is that right?
Yes, that is the plan. Yes, that is the plan, so that we can, so it'll also be an accountability tool. So I should also mention, and people here in my office will want me to make sure to ask you to also include not just our website, but we also have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, and please follow us, like us, all of those things.
And I'm glad you said that. And
we also
we'll
have
make
a
sure.
month.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have a monthly e-newsletter,
Oh,
and
good.
anybody who's interested, it's free, and so anyone who's interested can sign up online through our website.
Fantastic. Well, Maria Foscarinis, the founder and executive director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, what an important and I think very much underappreciated issue that needs a lot more attention. I'm really glad you could be on our podcast to shed some light on this. I know we didn't have nearly enough time to go into more, but we covered it a good bit, and I really appreciate your time in helping us do that. Thanks, Maria.
Well, great. I appreciate your interest in it. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
Thanks.